My number one prospect for the New Orleans Saints at pick number 9 overall is looking more and more likely by the day, and that's where we're going to start on today's Mock Draft Monday. We got all that and a little bit of lanyap for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're doing our 7-round post-week 1 of free agency mock draft. We'll get some late-round steals in the trenches, dive into some mid-round depth, as well as some guys with some starting upside. And we're going to lead everything off with my number one prospect at number 9 for the Saints still on the board. We got all that and much more for you on today's episode. Whether it's your first time or your next time, we thank you for being here this time, making us your first listen and being it every day or here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, where you can make every moment more. Right now, you can get $200 in bonus bets as a new customer if your first $5 bet wins. The New Orleans Saints at pick 9 overall in the first round of the NFL draft. I was able to land for them my number one prospect for them in terms of those that are most realistic at number 9, an Arizona wide receiver, Tetairoa McMillan. So let's go ahead and get started with our 7-round mock draft here. The focus here is the first week of free agency is done, trying to fill any remaining needs, add depth, all of those things. So a couple of key things we're going to try to do here is grab that big-bodied wide receiver. We're doing that right off the top. We'll break that down here in a little bit. I want to get a starting cornerback. I want to walk out of this draft with some offensive line depth, including a potential starter on the offensive line. And then I want to continue to build depth in some underrated places as well. Edge rusher, linebacker, safety, and more. So that's the goal for today's show. And I'm going to tell you right away, we're going to knock all of it right out off the board. We're going to hit all of it here. So round 1, pick number 9, almost said number 4. Pick number 9 is Tetairoa McMillan, the big-bodied 6'4", 219-pound wide receiver out of Arizona. The Wildcat would come in and immediately have an impact on this New Orleans Saints offense as a direct complement and contributor in the passing game, a direct complement to the speed that guys like Rashid Shaheed as well as Chris Olave bring. He can play inside and out, move him around the formation, gives you a big-bodied contested catch, slant runner, but that can do a lot more as well. The guy is simply a playmaker by trade. 84 catches, 1,319 receiving yards last year, and 8 touchdowns with Arizona. Did not compete, or rather did not participate in the Combine. Combine's not about competition. So did not participate in the Combine, and also is not expected to participate in the Big 12 Pro Day later on this month in just a few days, but that's okay. We know what we're getting in a Tetairoa McMillan who comes in and immediately complements that entire passing game and really opens up the game for New Orleans. This is a guy that takes your 1st and 10 and turns it into a 2nd and 4. This is a guy that takes your 2nd and 4 and turns it into a 1st and 10. That's the kind of player that you want back on this offense in the passing game. And it kind of gives Kellen Moore his CeeDee Lamb or Amari Cooper early on in Dallas, gives him his Keenan Allen, gives him his A.J. Brown, the big-bodied guy that can go out there and win the tough catches and make catches while completely draped in coverage, make those impressive, spectacular catches as well. Also a go up and get it kind of guy, and a guy that moves smoothly enough that he can create some separation for you and even pick up some yards after the catch as well. Tetairoa McMillan, who would contribute as a blocker in the run game, easily my number one prospect for the New Orleans Saints at number 9. Glad we were able to grab in this mock draft. I'm going to give you an alternative to these top 2 selections here in just a moment, but my next selection goes Ole Miss cornerback Trey Amos. Not a guy that we've talked about much on this show. 6 foot, 195 pounds, has the movement ability and the processing ability to be scheme versatile, which is really important in Brandon Staley's defense, which is pattern matching. You'll drop back into a zone, watch to see how players release off the line of scrimmage, what's the pattern, and then from that, you have a set of rules that eventually actually ends up transitioning you into man coverage. It sounds complicated, but really all zone coverage turns into man coverage at some point. But the processing ability of being able to recognize releases, understand how plays are developing in front of you, matching patterns, all that. A guy like Trey Amos could immediately become a starter on the outside for you, along with Kool-Aid McKinstry. Allows you to be able to utilize Alontae Taylor, put him back in the slot in that star position, and then have Isaac Yiadom as a veteran corner that either starts the season on the outside until Trey Amos is ready, or that ends up giving you really valuable depth. And at the absolute least, Yiadom ends up being a fantastic special teamer for you. No issues across all those boards. 50 total tackles for Amos, 4 of which were for a loss. He's also a solid tackler, by the way. 51.6% completion percentage allowed last year. 3 interceptions, 13 passes defended, and ran 4.43 40. So you see the speed, you see the ball skills, the ball processing, the processing ability when you watch him on tape. Just a physical outside corner that fits exactly what it is that the New Orleans Saints might be looking for at this position. I want to push pause real quick on the mock draft and tell you that if Tetairoa McMillan, for instance, goes off the board to the New York Jets a little bit earlier than the New Orleans Saints, or 1 pick ahead to the Carolina Panthers, that there's still a way for the Saints to win rounds 1 and round 2 with a wide receiver and corner. You just have to flip the order. So if Tetairoa McMillan is not on the board at 9, Jahdae Barron at Texas is becoming my second favorite prospect, or maybe third favorite prospect behind Mason Graham, who could potentially fall, the defensive tackle out of Michigan. But if you grab a guy like Barron in the first round and then turn around in the second round and land a wide receiver like Stanford's Alec Ayumanor, then you're getting effectively the same archetypes, a little bit more versatility when it comes to what you're getting from Barron, but then a little bit more of the physical blocking, a little bit more polished route running in Alec Ayumanor. And so both of those guys could be excellent alternatives to these 2 selections. So just so that said as well, to where you don't have to hit Tetairoa McMillan and Trey Amos, or Tetairoa McMillan and Benjamin Morrison, or Tetairoa McMillan and another corner. You don't have to necessarily do it in that order. It could be Barron out of Jahdae Barron out of Texas, and then another wide receiver in the second round. And you're finding just as much potential success with both of those guys. Round 3, pick 71. I went a route that I don't typically go, but look, I had 3 running backs that I could have chosen from here. Travion Henderson out of Ohio State, Dylan Sampson out of Tennessee, and Cameron Skattebo out of Arizona State. Just because I haven't talked about him as much on the show, I went with Cameron Skattebo for this draft, but really any of those 3 guys would have been wins at running back in round 3, pick 71. But I'm going Skattebo here, and the reason why is because if you want him to rush, he can do it. You want him to block, he can do it. You want him to run routes, he can do it. You want him to catch, he can do it. He does everything, and he does all of it with a dominant mentality, which I think is really important. The Saints don't have many dominant mentalities, guys that line up and make a defense afraid of what they might do next. I don't know that the Saints have that mentality, that personality, that attitude that's so outwardly displayed as what we used to see in the earlier days of Michael Thomas and things like that. And so when you find these dominant personalities, I think they're worth investing in. You get one earlier on in this draft with Tetairoa McMillan. You get a second one here with Cam Skattebo. He might be 5'9", 219 pounds, but he plays much bigger than he looks, runs through contact, picks up blitzers with no problem. 1,711 rushing yards, 21 rushing touchdowns, added 3 touchdown receptions as well. Explosive as they get at the position. Cam Skattebo, absolute playmaker to add to the top of this draft. We're going to continue on, getting some, at the worst, depth players to shore up in the middle rounds, but these guys have some starter upside as well. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at Monarch Money. Monarch Money is awesome. I use the app all the time. It's basically, I like to call it like your own personal CFO, right? Helping you gain full visibility and control of your finances. And that's not just your bank account, right? Yes, you can see what your accounts are looking like, but you can also track your investments. You can track your spending, your budgeting, all in one place as well. It's easily my favorite thing about Monarch Money, which you can find over at monarchmoney.com today, a complete financial command center so you can stop managing your money and start building wealth instead. All in one. It's very convenient. I was able to take like 3 or 4 different apps and culled them all the way down to just the Monarch Money app to get exactly what it was that I needed. So take control of your finances today with Monarch Money. Use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off of your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. Today's episode also brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and the place that's helping you get in on all the action as March Madness is here, and it'll help you get in all tournament long. And right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets by simply winning your first $5 bet over at FanDuel.com today. That's $200 in bonus bets to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories and even who's cutting down the net by the time that the tournament comes to an end. Today's Locked On Saints favorite for your first $5 bet. Heavy favorite tonight, the Los Angeles Lakers over the San Antonio Spurs. 9-point favorites. Put your first $5 down on the Lakers on the money line so that if they win, you get a little bit of winnings, minus 360, but you also get that $200 in bonus bets that you can use all across the site. So visit FanDuel.com today to get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. That's FanDuel.com. All right, family, we added some dominant mentality playmakers in the first 3 selections of this draft with wide receiver Tetairoa McMillan, cornerback Trey Amos, as well as running back Cameron Skattebo. Now, I want to take a look at adding depth in the middle rounds, but depth with starter upside, and we might have a new starter at left guard with this next selection. At round 3, pick 93, we go with Georgia offensive lineman Tate Ratledge. Now, if you're an everydayer, you hear me talk about Tate Ratledge all the time. Really, any of the 3 interior offensive linemen from Georgia make a lot of sense to me. Jared Wilson is another example. He's a guy that has that center versatility as well as being able to play on the inside as well. These 3 guys are fantastic, but Tate Ratledge is probably my top prospect. 4.95 40-yard dash, or top prospect of those 3, 4.95 40-yard dash, somebody that shows you the athleticism that he can bring in the run game as well as what he can do in the passing game. Played 500 total offensive snaps last year, allowed just 4 hurries, 2 hits on the quarterback, and 1 sack. I'll take that when it comes to protecting Derek Carr in 2025 and whoever the quarterback ends up being beyond that in the days beyond. But Ratledge, for me, will have to make some adjustments in the NFL, but I think that he's somebody that can be a starter at the next level. At the very, very least, he gives you a depth player that can play anywhere on the interior, left or right guard. And at 6'6", 308 pounds, if you had to kick him outside, I'm sure you could do that in a pinch as well. But obviously you want him playing to his strengths. And I think that with head coach Kellen Moore and his offense being one that's going to want to contribute a balanced run game approach to the offense, a little bit inside, a little bit outside, a little bit man, a little bit zone, a guy with the versatility and athleticism of a Tate Ratledge would be a really, really good fit for New Orleans. And so even if he doesn't end up becoming a starter right away, he could still very well be an early career starter, kind of in the hopes of what they were hoping to get with Nick Saldiveri years ago, which could still pan out. But until that does, I think you should continue to invest in this position. Yes, the Saints went and signed Will Clapp to bring him back to New Orleans. However, I don't know that he's going to be somebody that immediately comes in and becomes a starter. But to be fair, we didn't think about that when it came to Lucas Patrick either. And Lucas Patrick ended up being a pretty effective starter to start the season last year in 2024. The issue was health and consistency after that, having to move from guard to center to guard to center to guard to center and all these other things. So for New Orleans, like adding Will Clapp, having, potentially bringing back Landon Young, adding a guy like Tate Ratledge, and having Nick Saldiveri in the building, building up the depth of the offensive line is just as important right now, though you'd love for them to find a starter at left guard. Ratledge kind of walks the line in between potential starter and certainly a quality depth contributor as well. Getting started here in round 4, pick 112. We're using our updated draft selections now, so you're going to hear some numbers that are a little bit different. But we're outside of the top 100 into the top 130. Pick 112 here in round 4 goes to Clemson linebacker Barrett Carter. Now, this pick is a place where I typically see round 4 pick 130 as a potential trade piece to move up at an earlier point in the draft. Let's say that the Saints, instead of wanting Trey Amos in the second round, they wanted to move up a few more picks to ensure that they got a guy, or excuse me, instead of getting him in the second round, they wanted to go for like an edge rusher or a defensive tackle in the second round, like a Talik Williams, for instance. But then in the third round, they wanted to move up for a corner like a Dorian Porter out of Iowa State. Pick 130 is a good piece to trade in this draft. This is kind of the place where I get really close to looking at potentially moving picks and stuff like that. But pick 112 is one that I think you can still use. And so at pick 112, I went with Barrett Carter, the linebacker out of Clemson. Sometimes I go with Jack Kaiser out of Notre Dame, sort of in this range, but I haven't talked about Barrett Carter yet, so I wanted to make sure I worked him into this episode. He's a little bit undersized for the position, 6 foot even, 231 pounds, but he is a pure coverage inside linebacker. That would be a pretty good scheme fit for a 3-4 defense that's looking for their corners to their linebackers, inside linebackers, to effectively be able to get downhill in a hurry and cover. Not necessarily rush the passer, things like that. 82 total tackles last season for Clemson, had 11 of those for a loss, added 3.5 sacks as well. So you see how he can put a little bit of that pressure on. But some of those sacks also came with tracking quarterbacks that scrambled outside the pocket and then were able to close in because there was no coverage assignment, not necessarily being a blitzer. He was able to do that as well. But also 7 passes defended as well as a fumble recovery. So where the ball is, Barrett Carter's done a good job of getting around that area. 4.64 40-yard dash at his pro day. He said he never wants to run a 40 again. He's not going to be asked to do much of that in the league, of course, running 40 yards in a straight line, but still fairly decent speed at the position, good athleticism as well. And then 34.5-inch vertical, not the most impressive when it comes to explosion, but not bad either. So just being able to get off the line, read the defense and read the offense, and being able to transition what he's seeing to his attack and being able to burst from, a standing point on his toes to be able to go and get where he needs to get, right? Fire after the ball, get to the ball, all those other things, kind of see ball, get ball mentality in those situations. But what he could do as a weak side coverage linebacker, I think, might be even more intriguing. 6.97 unofficial RAS, doesn't crack the 8.5 threshold, but that's okay. You can see the athleticism in his game when you cut on the tape. So just an interesting option at linebacker for New Orleans. Now we get to that pick that I was talking about, round 4, pick 131. I decided to use it here, even though I kind of reached a little bit for a player based on projected kind of big board rankings and things like that. But I actually don't think that this one is as much of a reach. This might be one of my favorite 130 selections. And much like Barrett Carter, who could start off as a solid special teamer and depth player, you see the same thing with this player, but could potentially end up being called into action at some point, either in the near future or due to injuries, whatever it might be. And so I picked 131 in the 4th round. I went with Washington State wide receiver Kyle Williams. Kyle Williams, 5'10", 190 pounds, just hits the threshold that has been consistent for New Orleans. But that threshold maybe doesn't matter anymore, right? Like those aren't the prototypes that maybe the Saints feel that they need in their roles anymore. But the reason why I doubled up at wide receiver, which the Saints don't double up at positions very often. They did last year with like a 7th round selection and a 1st round selection, right? Taliese Fuanga as well as Josiah Aziram. But this is one that makes sense to me. You got the big bodied wide receiver, but you know what you still kind of lack on offense right now is that yards after catch threat. That guy that can get into open space and then blow the play open with run after catch ability. And Rashid Shaheed certainly has that because of his returner ability, but Kyle Williams has done it more often in the passing game. 1,198 receiving yards last year, 590 of those coming after the catch. He's just explosive with the ball in his hands. 14 touchdowns, 70 receptions while over at Wazoo. 4.4 even, 40-yard dash with a 36.5-inch vert. So you're seeing explosion, you're seeing speed, you're seeing the ability to be able to pick up yards after catch, solid hands as well. He could be a really interesting addition to this Kellen Moore offense. You could invest in a tight end here as well, like a Mitchell Evans out of Notre Dame. But I decided to do something a little bit different this time, and I'm curious your thoughts on it. But a Kyle Williams, who is an explosive run after catch, yards after catch receiver here in the 4th round, doesn't feel like a bad selection to me, and feels like somebody that could be good depth, but could potentially also end up being a game-breaking presence when called upon, if he's ever called upon as a starter as well. Coming up next, I want to continue to build up some depth, so I want to go with some late-round steals in the trenches, which have absolutely been the focus of the New Orleans Saints offseason so far. We have that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The NCAA tournament is here, and so is the bracket breakdown.
Locked On Podcast Network and Amazon Fire TV channels are teaming up to deliver NCAA tournament coverage like never before. Watch studio shows featuring former players and Locked On's local experts as they guide you through every upset, buzzer beater, and bracket matchup.
Stream it all for free on Amazon Fire TV channel. Search Bracket Breakdown to see it all for free.
It's your team every day.
Let's get it, Who Dat Nation, wrapping up this mock draft Monday with a look at some depth in the trenches. And of course, adding the special teams as well, which I do think is a need for New Orleans, particularly when it comes to punt and kick coverage. But we'll get to that here in a moment. Let's continue on here. Round 6, pick 184. Jonah Monheim out of USC. I know he's dealt with some injuries, but played 807 snaps last year, 0 sacks allowed, 2 quarterback hits, and 14 hurries. He comes in as a center, mostly, but has played all along the offensive line, particularly on the interior at 6'4", 302 pounds, somebody that you could absolutely move around. So this is another place where I think you could continue to invest in the trenches and the depth of your offensive line, particularly on the interior. You could go defensive tackle here. I almost went with Utah defensive tackle, Junior Tafuna as well, who, is 300 plus pounds, 6'3", doesn't have a ton of, he's a converted linebacker to defensive tackle. So he's a bigger body, but has good athleticism, but doesn't have a lot of strength because of the conversion. And so you'd have to build up a little bit of that. So I get worried about him being a guy that you would rely on in the interior as somebody that could get moved off the ball and things like that. But we are talking about 6th-round picks here as well. So it is worth keeping that in mind. So we're thinking about depth. We're thinking about emergency. We're thinking about somebody that maybe makes a practice squad and develops over time. And I think that a guy like Jonah Monheim could end up developing into a quality depth piece because of his ability to play center in particular, but also his ability to be able to play at guard. He'll have to develop his strength a little bit more, build his strength a little bit more to kind of compensate for his lack of reach. Comes in with just 30.13-inch arms. So you'd like to see him be, a little bit stronger because of that and all those other things. But if he can win leverage battles, if he can, get the appropriate development and training under Brendan Nugent, under Eric McCoy, then I think you might have a potential just center depth player for the next few years, which I think is really valuable here, and especially good value to get in the 6th round. At round 7, pick 248, a guy that I am ready to call the steal of the draft, Missouri edge rusher Johnny Walker Jr. We've discussed him on the show before. The Saints did re-sign Chase Young. Carl Granderson is still in the building. Isaiah Foskey is still in the building. But with Tano Passanio being on the market right now, not having been brought back as of the time that I'm recording this, and with Peyton Turner headed over to the Dallas Cowboys, I think continuing to invest in the edge rusher position makes sense. And you could do that earlier. I almost went with a Kyle Kennard out of South Carolina. I like a lot of those South Carolina defensive players. The safety, Nick Imanwari, the defensive tackle, and TJ Sanders. And I think that, he could be another good player along with that South Carolina Gamecocks defense. But Johnny Walker Jr. was somebody that I wanted to fold back into the mix here. It's 6'2", 248 pounds. He's a stand-up speed rusher, and he's a really, really good one. 43 total tackles last year, including 13 tackles for a loss. So not only is he getting involved as a pass rusher, but he is a solid player against the run as well. 9.5 sacks last season, forced 3 fumbles, recovered a fumble, and defended a pass at the line of scrimmage. So again, not only are you looking to affect the game by getting to the quarterback, but when you get to the quarterback, you're trying to affect the ball as well. And a guy like Johnny Walker Jr. has shown that he can do that. I know that he's a smaller guy in terms of height, 6'2". You'd like for that to be more like 6'4", 6'5", maybe even 6 foot, or maybe even 6'3". But at that point, we're kind of splitting hairs. If 1 or 2 inches of height is going to all of a sudden make this guy no longer a good pass rusher, then there's some other contributing factor to that. It's not just that he lacks being 6'4" as opposed to being 6'2". But at 248 pounds, he distributes his weight well, moves extremely well. He's a very good speed rusher, could be a stand-up guy in this Brandon Staley defense. I'm so excited to see what he transitions to if he lands in the right system in the NFL. I don't even know if he's going to be a 7th-round pick by the time that the entire process is all said and done. Missouri's pro day is March 21st. He was a snub He was snubbed in the pro day, in the combine last month. And so seeing him at his pro day in just a few days on March 21st, that might change everything in terms of what his draft projections look like. But right now, he's tracking as a 6th, 7th rounder. I'm perfectly happy with that. Like if I can get a guy like this in day 3 period, I don't care if it's round 4, 5, 6, or 7, potential to be a steal in this draft. And then finally, round 7, pick 254, I went with Maryland safety Dante Trader Jr. Now, Dante Trader has shown some ball skills throughout his time. Just last year, an interception as well as 4 passes defense, has 5 interceptions on his career. So you're seeing some ball production there. But on top of that, he had a really, really high forced incompletion rate, one of the highest among safeties in this year's draft at 21.7%. Just to kind of put that in perspective for you, 2 years ago, back in 2023 for the Saints in the NFL, a 30% forced incompletion rate by Isaac Adams was number 1 in the NFL for qualifying corners. And within the top 6 was also Paulson Adebo with a 22% forced incompletion rate. Here we are talking about a safety with a 21.7% forced incompletion rate percentage. So pretty nice in terms of what you're seeing there. But when he makes it into the NFL at 5'10", 196 pounds, as a solid tackler with good speed and athleticism, he's probably a special teamer. And I think that there's value in that for New Orleans, especially in round 7, in undrafted free agency. Ugo Amadi right now, the Saints safety who was a core special teamer, is on the market. He has not been brought back at this time. Cornerback Shamar Jean-Charles is with the Seattle Seahawks. This gives you an opportunity to add another young player that can come in, and along with Rico Payton, along with JT Gray, along with Isaac Adams, if he's called into that role, to be another one of those secondary core special teamers, much like Barrett Carter from earlier in the draft at linebacker. Dante Trader Jr. gives you some possible depth on the defensive side at safety for sure, but also more immediately gives you a special teams contributor, which I do think is necessary in this draft. All right, so let's check our boxes. Wide receiver, big-bodied wide receiver, yards after catch wide receiver, check and check. Offensive line, got a potential starter at left guard as well as additional depth on the interior, check and check. Running back, a versatile complement to Alvin Kamara that has that dominator's mentality, check. Linebacker, adding some depth there behind Demario Davis and Pete Werner, kind of a check in terms of what you got there in Barrett Carter. And then continuing to build up some reinforcements in the defensive line. I didn't grab anybody on the interior. I did grab somebody for the edge, though. Maybe we missed on interior there. But also, you got to wonder, with the Saints having signed Jonah Williams, with the Saints having brought back Nathan Shepard as well as Colin Saunders and traded for Devon Gottschalk, maybe they feel pretty good about where they are with Brian Brzee in the lead. I don't know, but that's one that we didn't take care of. So maybe a position where we missed there. But outside of that, got the starting corner as well. I think we did some good things with this mock draft. And so let me know what you think. It's also written up over at LouisianaSports.net if you want to read a little bit more about some of this. But really pleased with this draft, especially still not trading in drafts yet. I like what we were able to get in terms of this mock. So let me know what you think as well. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we're going to speak with Devon Gottschalk as well as Juwan Johnson later on today at the Saints facility. So I'll bring you some insight from those conversations as well as tracking more and more of what it is that the New Orleans Saints need to get done this offseason. We got that coming up for you as we continue on with another episode, tomorrow's episode of Locked On Saints. We appreciate you very much making us your first listen. For your second listen, go and check out Locked On NFL. And we thank you for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust to that nation, I'll holla at you.